Please be seated. Good morning. I have to recall to you the first time I set foot in this space. I was here as one of several candidates interviewing who would become the next rector. We came in this door in the dark of night because they were afraid I might be seen by somebody else. And I was immediately struck by the beauty of the space and the majesty of being able to face one another as we worship God and sing songs together. But I have to tell you that no more than I make it across the room admiring the space, and then I notice something else wonderful about this space. It's got padded pews. And I observed aloud to those who were interviewing me, "Oh, this is good." And they said, "Yeah, our space is really nice." I said, No. The pads on these pews are really great. And they said, "What do you mean?" I said, "People will be comfortable no matter how long I preach." So, that was like full disclosure. I thought, if I just put this out there in the interview process, they've really got no standing if I go on a little long some Sunday. So if you're unhappy with the length of the sermon today, you can complain to the search committee. Would you stand? No, you don't need to stand. I do think it's important when you're going to tell a longer story than normal to give people a little bit of a heads up so they don't sit there and wonder, when's he getting to the scripture? But it is a high holy day of All Saints, and I have a story that I think will help us remember it and kind of understand not only All Saints Day, but hopefully create new understanding for us around this passage in John as well. Now, many of you know that my first call out of seminary was in Alaska. And we went and we served several ministries while we were there, and one of the things that we did is we volunteered to go out to villages or remote places around the holidays. So the bishop and his staff were always looking for people who would volunteer because there were a lot of villages that were literally hundreds of miles off of the road system and took a half a day or more to get to by small plane. And they didn't have a priest regularly. They worshipped with lay leadership, reading morning prayer or evening prayer. And so they tried to ensure that at least a couple of times a year, around Christmas and Easter in particular, maybe once during the summer, a priest would travel out there and make visits and provide Eucharist. And I'd heard about how wonderful and enriching this was to do, to go out and make connections, to observe community in a different way because they rely on one another. These are villages often of 100 to 300 people living hundreds of miles off the road system. So we were eager to participate in this. So our first Christmas there, we said, well, we'll go. And they said, well, we don't have a lot of clergy who will go from the Anchorage area, but there's these 3 villages that are on the lower Yukon River, and if you can go, it'd be really great if you could go to all 3. I was already beginning to see that I might be bamboozled as the new guy. But I said yes, and not only did I say yes, my beautiful bride, Sarah, and my son, who was very little at the time, much littler than he is now, went along with, and we spent a week traveling to these 3 different villages, and we experienced firsthand the joy of being in community in a different fashion, but we also experienced how difficult it can be to live that far out in the middle of nowhere in the middle of winter. And so intermixed with all the joy and celebrating Christmas and Eucharist and things with these different villages, it was our first experience. We had called ahead to make sure we had arrangements. The bishop's office had called ahead to make arrangements. We'd exchanged emails, and still, when we arrived in Grayling, the second village we visited, we got off of the airplane in the middle of late December, and there's not really an airport building like what we have in Dallas. There's not really an airport building like you have in a much smaller town. There's a shack where they keep the truck with the plow on it to keep the runway clear, and people come out to greet the plane to pick up the mail and the other supplies and the occasional passenger that comes off of a plane. Now, when we arrived in Shagaluk, the only truck in town was there to drive us into town, which was, we would learn later, a real blessing and a treat. Because we arrived at Grayling and we got off the plane, and there was a crowd standing there, so we went up. We said, well, I'm Father Paul, this is my wife Sarah. And they looked at me and they said, who are you? And I said, I'm Father Paul, this is my wife Sarah. And they looked at me and they said, who are you? And I said, I'm Father Paul, this is my wife Sarah. And they looked at me and they said, who are you? And I said, I'm Father Paul, this is my wife Sarah. And they looked at me and they said, who are you? And I said, I'm Father Paul. I'd called ahead. I talked to so-and-so in the village, in the office, and they said, oh. I said, is there somebody here who can maybe give us a ride? And they said, well, I guess we could give you a ride. And they made room in the truck for Sarah and Noah because it was cold out, and we had a baby, and I think I rode in the back of the truck, and we made our way down there, and we got to the village office, and we walked in, and they said, who are you? Where did you come from? What are you doing here? And they said, well, yeah, you can stay upstairs. There's other clergy who've stayed upstairs. And, imagine that closet at home that you put all those holiday decorations in. It looked a little more like that than the accommodation that you might expect. And we were kind of making our way around, and then they said, you're going to have to stay upstairs for a while because we've got this thing going on downstairs. It's perfectly legal, they say. I wasn't worried until you said that. They were doing some kind of pull-tab fundraiser for the community, and we said, all right. And then not long after that, someone called for me, and then someone came to visit, and all these problems started to arise. Who was going to turn the electricity onto the church? Turn the electricity onto the church? I didn't even know it needed to be done. Who was going to start a fire to make sure the place got warmed up? Fortunately, someone had taken care of these things in the first village we went to. And by the way, we haven't shoveled the church out since the last priest came through in July. So someone should go over and take care of these things. And I said, oh, all right, well, welcome to Grayling, So I went out and started shoveling out a hard snowpack, blown closed trail to the church. And I was trying to figure out how to get in and how to get the power on and how to start a fire. And someone came by. I thought, oh, good, someone's here to help. And they said, hey, I'm not sure you paid for your ticket. We have to go call Frontier Air. I thought, really? Because they're trying to shovel out the church first, And things just kept on arriving. Eventually, it all came around, and it all got taken care of. But my favorite memory of Grayling, and you think I was turning the corner here, but you got to stay comfortable on those padded pews, I'll remind you, is a couple years later when I was there by myself. And in rural Alaska, flights aren't exactly like you find here with a big board to tell you if your flight's late and which gate to change to and this kind of thing. You have to be, if your flight's at noon, we better be ready by 11:30 because the plane just might show up at 11:30, or it might show up at 12:30 or 1:30 or 2:30, depending on the weather and what order the pilot decides to go based on how much mail he has for the different villages. So it's kind of being ready is the theme. Be ready because you don't know the hour in which Jesus comes, nor a plane in rural Alaska. And so we were ready. I was ready, sitting there reading a book or something, and it got to be several hours past the point of departure, and it was getting dark. And they can fly at dark, but they usually don't out there. And I thought, I wonder if what happened. So I picked up the phone and I called. I said, hey, I'm sitting here in Grayling. Did I miss something? Because you can hear the plane usually. Small town, I'll remind you. Not a lot of engine noise going on. And they said, oh, that flight got canceled. Oh, thanks. So I said, well, they said, yeah. I said, well, do I need to rebook? Thinking like the rest of us think when our flight gets canceled, I need to rebook on another flight, right? Well, no. They said, they'll just put you on tomorrow's flight to Shagaluk, which is where I was going next. I said, well, actually, I'm supposed to be back for meetings in Wasilla. I guess I'll have to buy a return ticket to just take me home. And they said, oh, well, yeah, you'll have to call because they'll just assume you're going to Shagaluk. So I was trying to figure all this out, and I got another call from the chief. Now, I'd gone to the village a couple of times, and the chief appreciated this, and he showed his appreciation by calling me St. Paul. St. Paul's of Grayling was the church, and so I picked up, he said, St. Paul? I said, no, it's Father Paul. He says, St. Paul? I was like, yeah, sure, okay. And he said to me, how much cold weather gear do you have? Why, Chief? Is it supposed to get worse? And he said, no, I was going to try to get somebody to drive you to Shagaluk. Now, mind you, there's no road. He's talking about driving me on the back of a snow machine. And I said, well, how cold is it? He says, well, it's only 10 below. And I said, how cold is it going to get tonight? He says, it's not going to drop that much, just to get a little bit colder. And he said, so what could you ride that? And I said, how far is it? He said, well, it usually takes 2.5 hours in the back of a snow machine to get there. I want to see he says, but Father, he said, we don't see a priest out here very often. And I really want to help get you there so that they can have Christmas service, so they can have the sacraments and a visit. And I said, well, all right, if I had snow pants and a better hat, I think I could make it. He said, well, I'll call you back. Now, half an hour goes by. I'm kind of still sitting ready, not sure. I know I'm not flying out, but I don't know what's going to happen next. And someone pulled up, no phone call. Someone pulled up. I thought, well, the chief's stopping by to talk to me. But no, a guy comes in with a whole armful of cold weather gear, drops it on the table, and he says, how soon can you be ready? 10 minutes. Give me 10 minutes. The next thing I know, I'm on a snow machine trekking across rural Alaska, through the woods, down onto the Yukon River, through the woods, down onto the Yukon River, because for those who don't know, the Yukon River kind of travels like this. And so for the next 2.5 hours, we traversed the Yukon River in the woods on our way to Shagaluk. When we arrived, I realized why I was supposed to be there. Because it was the first day of a traditional 4-day wake. And as we entered the fellowship space of the community, everybody was there. Everybody from Shagaluk, half of Grayling, half of Vanvik, half of the village of St. Mary's, had arrived to mourn the loss of a man that they knew and loved. And I arrived after 2.5 hours in the back of a snow machine trying to thaw out my fingers and figure out which way was up and realize what was going on. And they had a table lined up with food, and they'd waited for us to start. And, their prayers were answered because they told me they were answered. They prayed that I might get weathered in. And indeed, I was weathered into Shagaluk, Alaska for 4 days. For 4 days, I sat in the fellowship hall. I had a place to sleep at night, but we sat together as a community, and we ate 3 meals together each day, and we sang songs together, and we prayed together, and we mourned the loss of a man from that village who was laid out on a mat on the floor. And in between it all, people would take turns sitting and saying their goodbyes. And it developed a real understanding of why many cultures have a tradition of holding multiple days of wake as a community. And it helped me to understand what we have lost in our fast-paced culture when we brush past these moments in life when we're supposed to mourn. And I think, I think about those times often in Shagaluk, and after 4 days we did a funeral service, and the weather cleared, and I know that God answers prayers in some immediate ways as well. Now, what does this all have to do with All Saints' Day? What does this all have to do with the gospel? I hope that having heard that story, the story of Lazarus, takes on new meaning for you. I hope knowing this story and thinking about what it's like to sit as a community and break bread and sing songs and pray prayers together for 4 days straight in the context of the loss of a loved one, how they must have felt as Jesus arrives at the end of it. They're frustrated that Jesus didn't come in time to heal the man that they loved and knew, but more than that, they've been through 4 days of emotional journey and borne out their griefs and their sorrows to one another and restored whatever was broken with their relationship with the man that they had loved and lost. And they were raw emotionally as Jesus arrives. Probably why they argue with him a little bit when he's about to raise Lazarus from the dead. And what must it have been like once Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead to be in that community that had been through the journey of mourning and loss for 4 days together? How would their relationship with Lazarus have been changed? Indeed, they would have been transformed. I believe That sometimes we do ourselves a disservice when we rush past this mourning and loss, and I believe that All Saints' Day serves part of that purpose for us as we recall the losses of the year past, and indeed the loss of all the faithful that we have known and loved in our lives. And I hope that All Saints' Day for us is a chance to recall the good and let the bad of whatever that might have been in those relationships begin to melt away. And as we experience the newness of the relationship of the members of our congregation and our families and friends that have gone before us, the faithful that we recall on All Saints' Day, I hope that we see what we read of in Revelation, a new heaven and a new earth opened up before us as the majesty of Jesus is revealed in the memories of those who've led the way towards a life of discipleship, a life that exemplifies Jesus' love and mercy and grace before us. And I hope that that is what we find as we gather together on All Saints' Day. And I hope that it's what we find in the waters of baptism and in the bread and the wine as we come together to receive not only from ages past, but the future saints who sit among us. Amen.